For 10 years, I called her my sister. Not by blood. By choice. The kind of friendship you stop questioning because it's just always been there, like furniture, like weather. Vanessa and I met in a college dorm hallway when we were 19, and from that first semester on, she was simply part of the architecture of my life. The woman who stood beside me at my almost wedding when my own sister couldn't make the flight in time. The emergency contact on every form I ever filled out. The person who had my spare key, my Wi-Fi password, my mother's maiden name, because who keeps secrets from their sister? My name is Elena. I'm 34 years old, and until 2 years ago, I thought I understood exactly who I was and who had access to that. I didn't find out what Vanessa had done from her. I found out from a customs officer in a country I have never once set foot in, asking me, very politely, why I was trying to re-enter a nation I had apparently already been living in for 3 years. That's when I understood. Somewhere out there, wearing my name like a coat she'd stolen off the back of a chair, there was another version of me. A version with my social security number and a stranger's face. A version who owed money I never borrowed, who'd signed leases I never saw, who was, on paper, more real than I was. This is the story of how I hunted down the ghost of myself, and how the person I trusted most became the reason I had to prove, to my own government, that I still existed. That I should tell you who Vanessa was before I tell you what she became, because the two versions of her don't feel like they belong to the same person. For a long time, that gap is what kept me from believing any of this was real. We met the way a lot of lifelong friendships start, by accident, in a place neither of us chose. Freshman dorms, thin walls, a broken vending machine we both complained about separately before complaining about it together. She was funny in a dry, undercutting way, the kind of funny that made you feel like you were in on something the rest of the world wasn't. She remembered small details about people, my coffee order, the name of my childhood dog, the exact way I liked to be checked in on after a bad day without being asked directly if I was okay. I used to tell people that Vanessa paid attention like it was a form of love, and I meant it as the highest compliment I had. By senior year, we were inseparable in the specific way that only makes sense from the inside. We split rent on a 2-bedroom apartment 2 blocks from campus. She talked me through my worst breakup at 3 in the morning without once telling me she'd told me so. I edited her cover letters when she was job hunting. When my father got sick during our last semester, Vanessa was the one who drove me 4 hours home at 11 at night without asking a single question, just handed me a coffee and started the car. That's the kind of debt you don't know you're accumulating. Not money. Trust. And trust, I would learn, is the only currency identity thieves actually need. Over the next decade, our lives braided together the way close friendships do when you're building adult life at the same time. I got a job in claims administration, reviewing paperwork, verifying documentation, the kind of work that trains you to notice when something doesn't add up. Which is its own kind of irony, considering how long it took me to notice what was happening in my own life. I got married at 28, to a man named Marcus, and Vanessa was there for every part of it, the engagement dinner, the dress fitting where she sat in the chair beside the mirror and gave her honest opinion whether I asked for it or not, the maid of honor toast that made my mother cry. When Marcus and I separated 3 years later, quietly and without much drama, Vanessa was the one who helped me move my things into a new apartment, who sat on my floor eating takeout with me the first night I was alone again. Who told me I was going to be fine in a voice steady enough that I believed her. Vanessa, meanwhile, drifted. That's the generous word for it. She tried freelance consulting, then a logistics startup that folded within a year, then something vague involving international trade that she was always a little evasive about whenever I asked for specifics. I didn't push. You don't push your sister. You give her grace, you let her figure it out at her own pace, you assume that whatever she's not telling you is embarrassment, not architecture. Looking back, there's a stretch of about 8 months, roughly 3 years before everything came apart, where Vanessa asked me for things that felt small at the time and monstrous in retrospect. She asked to borrow my passport, just to photocopy it, for a freelance visa application she said she was helping a client with. Someone else's paperwork, she said. She just needed a sample document to show the format. She asked me to be a co-signer on what she described as a small business line of credit, then backed out of the ask a week later, saying she'd found another way, except she hadn't backed out. She'd simply stopped needing my signature on paper, because by then she already had a version of it she could forge. She asked, once, half joking, over wine on my couch, what my mother's maiden name was, for one of those password recovery things. I told her. I laughed. I didn't think about it again for 3 years. This is the part one needs you to sit with, because it's the part that took me the longest to forgive myself for. None of these moments felt like theft. They felt like friendship. That's what made her good at this. She didn't steal my identity in one dramatic heist. She borrowed it, piece by piece, over years, the way you'd borrow sugar from a neighbor, small enough each time that saying no would have felt paranoid, even cruel. The first sign something was wrong didn't look like a crime. It looked like customer service. It was a Tuesday in early spring. I got a call from my bank's fraud department, a friendly, procedural voice asking me to confirm a change of mailing address on my account. I hadn't changed my mailing address. I told her that. She paused, the kind of pause that tells you a person is reading something on their screen they weren't expecting to have to explain, and said the request had come through 2 weeks earlier, verified with my date of birth and the last 4 digits of my social security number. I froze my accounts that day, more out of caution than real fear. I assumed it was one of those wide net phishing operations, a stolen database, a bot trying addresses at random. I filed a report, changed my passwords, felt mildly violated in the way you do after these things, and moved on with my week. I even called Vanessa that night, half joking about it, and she said the exact thing I needed to hear. That's terrifying. You should get one of those credit monitoring things. I did. It would later tell me almost nothing, because by then the fraud wasn't happening on any account I was actively monitoring. It was happening in an entirely different country, under an entirely different set of institutions. 2 months later, a letter arrived from the IRS. Not a scary letter, at first glance, a routine notice about a discrepancy in reported income. Except the income in question wasn't income I'd reported, or earned, or even heard of. A company I didn't recognize, in an industry I'd never worked in, had filed a 1099 with my social security number for consulting work performed the previous year. I called the number on the letter. I spent 40 minutes on hold, then another 20 explaining to a patient but overworked IRS representative that I had never done consulting work for a shipping and logistics firm registered in a state I had never lived in. She was kind. She was also unable to tell me much beyond confirming that yes, the filing existed, yes, it used my social security number, and that this kind of thing was, unfortunately, common, and that I should file an identity theft affidavit and brace for a long process. I want to be honest about something. Even then, even with 2 separate red flags in 2 months, I did not think of Vanessa. Why would I? She was the person I called that night to vent about how exhausting bureaucracy is. She was sympathetic. She asked good questions. She told me identity theft rings usually buy data in bulk off the dark web, that it probably had nothing to do with me specifically, just bad luck, wrong database breach somewhere. I remember feeling comforted by that. I remember thinking, thank God I have someone steady to talk this through with. The third crack came from an unlikely source, my mother. She called me, confused, holding a letter from a mortgage company congratulating her on co-signing a loan for her daughter's new home purchase. In another state. A house I had never seen, in a city I had never visited, purchased under my legal name, using, as the paperwork would later reveal, a co-signer authorization with my mother's forged signature. That was the moment the shape of it started to change for me. This wasn't random. Random identity theft doesn't know your mother's name, doesn't know she'd be a plausible co-signer, doesn't know enough about your family structure to forge a signature that would pass a lender's basic verification. Random identity theft doesn't know you at all. Someone who knew me had done this. Or someone who knew me. The fourth crack, a few weeks after that, was smaller, and almost funnier, in the dark way these things eventually start to feel. My sister sent me a screenshot from a wedding registry site. A friend of hers had stumbled across a gift registry under my name, for a wedding, in a city I'd never been to a man I'd never heard of. Is this some kind of scam thing people do to you? My sister asked. I stared at the screen for a long time. Somewhere, a woman with my name was getting married. Building a life. Registering for dishes. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with 4 pieces of paper spread in front of me, the bank fraud alert, the IRS notice, the mortgage letter, the wedding registry screenshot, doing the thing my job had trained me to do for other people's claims for 8 years, looking for the pattern. Looking for the common thread. And the common thread, the only thread, was a version of me operating somewhere I had never been, building an entire life brick by brick, using details that only someone deeply embedded in my personal history could have supplied. I still didn't think of Vanessa. Not yet. I want to be honest about that, because I think it says something important about how this kind of betrayal survives. It survives by being unthinkable. Your mind protects the people closest to you by refusing to run the search. The thing that finally cracked it open wasn't a document. It was a photograph. A friend from college, someone Vanessa and I both knew, but who I hadn't spoken to in years, sent me a message that started with, "Weird question, but is this you?" Attached was a screenshot from a professional networking site, a profile with my full legal name, my old job title from 4 years back, and a headshot. It was not my face. It was a woman's photograph, mid-30s, professionally lit, using my name as her own. The profile listed a company, the same logistics and trade company from the IRS filing, and a location, a coastal city roughly 9,000 miles from where I was sitting. The bio described years of cross-border consulting experience, and used, verbatim, 2 phrases I recognized instantly because I had used them myself, in my own actual professional bio, years earlier. Phrases only someone who had read my resume closely, more than once, would know to lift. I sat with that screenshot for a long time before I let myself think her name. Then I did the thing that claims work had trained into me without my even realizing it. I stopped reacting and started building a timeline. I pulled every document I had, the bank alert, the IRS letter, the mortgage paperwork, the wedding registry, the profile screenshot, and laid them chronologically against the last 4 years of my own memory. Every date on that timeline had a matching entry in my actual life. A weekend Vanessa had visited and used my home Wi-Fi. A week she'd borrowed my laptop to fix her own. The month she'd asked to photocopy my passport. The season she'd gone quiet and evasive about the international trade work she was doing. The dates didn't just align. They interlocked, the way two gears interlock. Her access, timed precisely to my documented losses. I didn't confront her yet. I know that surprises people when I tell this story. They expect the phone call, the screaming, the immediate rupture. But 10 years of trust doesn't dissolve on a hunch, even a well-evidenced one. I needed to know, not suspect. So I did something that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. I kept being her friend while I quietly built a case against her. Over 8 weeks, I gathered what I could through legitimate means. Old emails where she'd asked for documents, the passport photocopy request in writing, a text thread from years earlier where she'd asked for my mother's maiden name, for a password reset. I filed a formal police report and an FTC identity theft complaint, laying out the timeline in as much detail as I could reconstruct. I hired an attorney who specialized in identity fraud, a woman named Priya who told me something that reframed the entire ordeal for me. What I was describing wasn't a hack. It was a slow-motion, relationship-based fraud, sometimes called friendly fraud in the industry, not because it's friendly, but because it exploits actual friendship as its access point. Statistically, she told me, the person responsible is far more likely to be someone you trust than a stranger. I already knew that. I was living inside the statistic. The investigative trail led somewhere I hadn't expected, a shell company, registered abroad, using a business address that turned out to be a mail forwarding service. The company had a bank account. The bank account had activity, deposits from consulting invoices billed to real clients, all under my name, all routed to an account I had never opened, in a country I had never visited. Whoever was running that company had built, over 3 years, an entire financial existence, credit history, a business reputation, a wedding, a fiancé who presumably had no idea he was marrying a fabricated version of a real, unconsenting woman on another continent, even what appeared to be a residency application in progress, the early stages of the secret life I'd eventually learn Vanessa was trying to make permanent. My existence had become her exit. I finally called her on a Sunday evening. I told her I needed to talk about something serious, and asked her to come over. I didn't tell her what. I wanted to see her face when I laid the documents on the table, because after 10 years, I still needed to watch her lie to me, or not, with my own eyes. She didn't lie. That was almost the worst part. When I slid the printed screenshot of the profile across the table, her choice of a stranger's face, my name, she went very still, and very quiet, and then she said, "I was always going to fix it before you found out." Fix it. As if it were a mistake she'd made, not a decade she'd spent building that I asked her to explain it to me. Not to justify it, I told her plainly I wasn't looking for that, but I needed to understand the mechanics of how 10 years of friendship had become raw material for a life I never agreed to fund. She told me it started small, exactly the way I'd pieced together. The passport photocopy became a template for a secondary identity document abroad, established through a broker. She'd found who specialized in exactly this kind of thing for people who, in Vanessa's words, needed a fresh start somewhere their name didn't already have too many closed doors. She said her own credit history, her failed businesses, a minor fraud allegation from years earlier that I'd never even known about, had made it nearly impossible for her to get approved for anything, visas, loans, even some jobs. She said she told herself, at first, that she was just going to use my clean credit history to get one loan, just once, just to get her footing, and pay it back before I ever noticed. She didn't pay it back. She built on it instead. Once the first fraudulent account existed and performed well, meaning, once nobody caught it, she said the temptation to keep going outweighed whatever guilt she felt, and the guilt itself got quieter every time she got away with the next step. The mortgage. The business registration. Eventually, terribly, even a relationship. A man abroad who believed he was engaged to a version of me that didn't exist, built out of my name and Vanessa's ability to perform charm convincingly enough to sustain it for over a year. I asked her if she had ever, at any point in 10 years, thought about what it would cost me. She said something I still think about, because of how small it made a decade of friendship sound out loud. She said I had everything already, and it seemed like it wouldn't really cost me anything. I left that conversation and didn't speak to her again outside of what the legal process eventually required. Here is what nobody tells you about discovering your identity has been stolen by someone you love. The emotional betrayal and the bureaucratic nightmare arrive at exactly the same time, and you don't get to grieve one before the other demands your full attention. While I was still absorbing what Vanessa had confessed, I also had to become, functionally, a full-time investigator into my own life. I had to prove, to a mortgage company, that I had never purchased a house I was legally listed as owning. I had to prove, to the IRS, that I had never earned income one was being taxed on. I had to prove, to a foreign consulate, that the residency application partially filed under my name was fraudulent, which meant submitting notarized statements, fingerprints, video-verified interviews, becoming, in the most literal sense, the only party who could prove I was actually myself. There's a specific kind of exhaustion in having to argue for your own existence to institutions that have no reason to believe you over a paper trail. The paper trail said I owned a house. The paper trail said I ran a consulting business abroad. The paper trail said I was engaged. The paper trail had 3 years of consistency behind it. I had my actual life, and it turned out that wasn't always enough. The legal fallout for Vanessa took over a year to resolve. Because the fraud crossed international lines, the shell company, the foreign bank account, the residency application, it triggered involvement not just from local police but eventually federal investigators, since wire fraud and identity theft across borders falls under federal jurisdiction. Priya warned me early that the process would be slow, and she was right. Evidence had to be gathered from 2 countries. Financial institutions in both jurisdictions had to cooperate, which took months of formal requests. There were points where I genuinely didn't know if it would ever result in real consequences for her, and that uncertainty was its own form of ongoing harm. There was also a person I hadn't accounted for in any of this, the man abroad who'd believed he was engaged to me. I never spoke to him directly, the investigators handled that contact, but I learned, secondhand, that he had to sit through his own version of this same unraveling. A relationship, a future, an entire emotional investment, built on a name that wasn't attached to a real person on the other end at all. I think about him more than I expected to. We were both used by the same person, in different ways, and neither of us had any say in it. Vanessa was eventually charged, identity theft, wire fraud, and forgery, given the falsified co-signer's signature tied to the mortgage. I won't pretend the legal process felt like closure. It felt like paperwork attached to a wound. What actually helped me start to heal wasn't the court date. It was the slow, boring, unglamorous work of rebuilding. Credit freezes lifted one institution at a time, a new identity theft case number that finally closed instead of opening a new one, a year where every quarter I checked my credit report and, for the first time in a long time, found nothing unfamiliar on it. My mother apologized to me at one point, oddly, for having co-signed a mortgage she never actually signed, as if the forged version of her signature was somehow her fault. It took me a long time to convince her it wasn't. I think betrayal like this doesn't just injure the person it's aimed at. It ripples outward to everyone who trusted the same person you did. I don't tell this story because I think Vanessa is uniquely monstrous. I tell it because the mechanism is so ordinary it should terrify all of us a little. She didn't need to hack anything. She didn't need sophisticated tools. She needed 10 years of small, reasonable-sounding requests, and the simple fact that people we love are the last people we think to protect ourselves from. I still don't fully understand why she did it, not really, not in the way that would make it make sense. What I understand now, that I didn't understand then, is that the people closest to us don't need to break in. We hand them the key ourselves, one small favor at a time, because refusing feels like an accusation we don't want to make against someone we love. If there's one thing I'd ask you to take from this, it's not paranoia. I don't want you distrusting the people who show up for you at 11 at night when your father is sick. It's this: notice the small requests. The photocopy of a document, just in case. The maiden name, for a password reset. The favor that seems too minor to say no to. Those aren't nothing. Those are the raw materials someone would need if they ever decided your life was easier to borrow than to build their own. I got my name back. It took 2 years, a small mountain of notarized paperwork, and a version of myself that no longer assumes trust is free just because it's long-standing. But I got it back. I am, finally, only myself. No ghost living a parallel life on the other side of the world wearing my name like it was hers to wear. If this story affected you, or if you've ever had to prove to a stranger on the phone that you are, in fact, still you, tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you haven't already, subscribe. There's more of these stories where this came from, every week.